The phone call came in the middle of the night, shattering the silence of Graceland. It was January 28, 1975, and Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was in trouble again. This time, it was more than just a bad concert or a missed deadline. Elvis was back in the hospital, and this time it was serious. Elvis had been feeling off for days, his body heavy and his mind clouded. He had tried to tough it out, but his father, Vernon, and his close friend, Joe Esposito, could see that something was wrong. They convinced him to see Dr. Nick, the trusted physician who had been by his side for years. Dr. Nick had seen Elvis in worse states before, but this time he knew it was different. The doctor made a quick call to the hospital, and a suite was prepared on the 18th floor of Baptist Hospital. At 5 a.m., Elvis, wearing navy blue pajamas and a dark beard, walked into the hospital, flanked by his father, Joe, his girlfriend Linda Thompson, and a few of his bodyguards. The hallway was dark, and the only sound was the soft shuffle of their footsteps. Once inside the suite, Linda shaved Elvis, and the hospital routine began. For the first few days, Elvis slept a lot. When he was awake, he talked to the nurses, trying to keep things light. One of the nurses, a recent graduate from the University of Arkansas, found herself dating one of Elvis's bodyguards. Another, a middle-aged woman named Marion Koch, would later write a book about her time with the king. But for now, they were just there to care for him. The doctors ran a series of tests. They found an enlarged colon, which they blamed on Elvis's poor eating habits. He loved fried foods and sugary treats, and it was clear that his diet needed a serious overhaul. They also discovered that Elvis was suffering from glaucoma, a condition that could lead to blindness if left untreated. They prescribed tinted contact lenses and medication to help manage the pressure in his eyes. But the most concerning issue was the result of a liver biopsy. The doctors found severe damage to the organ, and they suspected that drug abuse was the cause. Elvis had been using a lot of medication, and it was starting to take a toll on his body. He joked about the long needle used for the biopsy, but the seriousness of the situation was not lost on anyone. Elvis's stay at the hospital got even more complicated when his father, Vernon, had a heart attack. Vernon was rushed to the intensive care unit, and Elvis was moved to a suite next to his. The two men, who had been through so much together, were now both in the hospital, scared and vulnerable. Elvis visited his father often, trying to lift his spirits. One of the hospital staff remembered seeing Elvis come out of Vernon's room, tears streaming down his face. Despite the gravity of the situation, Elvis was still Elvis. He was cheerful and obedient, promising to change his ways. But everyone knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The king was in trouble, and it was going to take more than a hospital stay to fix things. Elvis left the hospital on February 14th, but the problems didn't end there. His relationship with his manager, Colonel Parker, was strained. The two men had been partners for 20 years, but their disagreements were becoming more frequent and more intense. Elvis grumbled about the tour dates, the Colonel's decisions, and even a joke album that the Colonel had released. The tension between them was palpable, and it seemed like only a matter of time before their partnership would crumble. But for now, Elvis was focused on getting back to what he did best, performing. He had a show in Las Vegas coming up in March, and he needed to prepare. He was still carrying extra weight, but his spirits were higher than they had been in years. The thought of being on stage, facing an audience, and feeling that raw energy was what kept him going. It was the one place where he could still feel like the king. Elvis Presley was at a crossroads. The world was changing, and so was he. But the king wasn't ready to give up the throne just yet. The show must go on. Elvis's 1975 Vegas engagement was a big deal. The hotel had just opened a new $20 million tower with 600 rooms, which meant more Elvis fans could be closer to their idol. The showroom had a new policy, too. Instead of waiters handing out checks, they sold tickets. The show now cost $20 per person, up from $17.50, and included 2 drinks or a half bottle of champagne, plus tax and tip. This change allowed the hotel to increase the room's capacity by 20%, making it more profitable. Elvis's music was still a huge hit. He released albums regularly, and they always made it to the bestseller lists. In 1974, He put out albums like Good Times and a live album from his Memphis concerts. But the pattern of his music was aimless, as Bob Hilburn noted. The albums lacked a clear direction, mixing old hits with new songs. Elvis loved spending money, and 1975 was his year for big purchases. His favorite jewelers were Saul Schwartz from Beverly Hills and Lowell Hayes from Memphis. Saul met Elvis in 1966, when Elvis was making a movie with Nancy Sinatra. Elvis liked Saul's jewelry so much that he lent Saul $50,000 to upgrade his inventory. Saul recalled how Elvis would visit the store almost daily, buying jewelry like a kid in a candy store. Elvis even gave away a $18,000 ring to a security guard who helped him in Vegas. Lowell Hayes, Elvis's Memphis jeweler, sold him even more jewelry, over $800,000 worth. Elvis took Lowell on tour and even on vacations. One time, Elvis flew them to Dallas and then to Palm Springs, where he had a department store open in the middle of the night, so he could buy everyone new clothes and accessories. Lowell learned to always bring his jewelry with him, or else Elvis would get upset. Despite the highs, Elvis also had lows. After his April Vegas engagement, he seemed depressed and didn't even show up to the closing night party. His mood swings continued during a 2-week tour of the South and a recording session in Los Angeles. Elvis was furious when the album's sound changed after the mix down in New York. He threatened to leave RCA and go with another label, but eventually the tapes were sent to Memphis for a remix. Elvis's health issues also worsened. In June, he went to the Mid-South Hospital for a few days. The press wasn't told, but it was partly for an eye examination and a facelift. After the procedure, he stayed at Graceland until the bruises faded. When he finally showed his face to a bodyguard, he lifted his hair to reveal the stitches. In July, Elvis went on another tour, but his mood was volatile. He had a falling out with one of his backup singers, Kathy Westmoreland, who was dating a band member. During a show in Greensboro, he made a crude comment about her, and she walked off the stage, followed by the Sweet Inspirations. The audience didn't seem to notice, but Elvis felt bad and asked his friends to apologize later. However, the girls refused to accept his apology. The next day before a show in Asheville, Elvis told everyone to leave early, but then changed his mind. The group was already at the airport when Elvis showed up and made everyone get off the plane. He left without them, leaving them stranded on the runway. Elvis's life was a mix of extravagant spending, high-energy performances, and emotional turmoil. Despite the ups and downs, he remained a beloved figure, and his fans continued to follow him wherever he went. Elvis stepped into his limousine in Asheville, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. He ordered the plane to return for his entourage. When the plane came back, one of his friends told Lowell, "Elvis wants to see you right away." Lowell walked into Elvis's hotel suite and found him in a generous mood. "I want to buy everybody something," Elvis said. He bought everything Lowell had, and when they ran out, he asked Lowell to get more from Memphis. Lowell called Memphis, arranged for more jewelry, and flew back with it. Elvis bought what seemed like an entire jewelry store, giving something to everyone in his group, including the backup singers. He even apologized to the Sweet Inspirations and gave each of them a $5,000 ring. Back in Memphis, Elvis still felt guilty about the incident on tour. He decided to do what he always did when he felt bad, go on a spending spree. This time he bought 14 Cadillacs and 2 airplanes. Over the next 10 years, Elvis owned at least 100 expensive cars, giving away many to his bodyguards, maids, nurses, friends, and even strangers. He spent more than $1 million on these gifts. A few days after the tour, Elvis and his friends drove to the Cadillac agency on Union Street. The salesman, Howard Massey, had been selling cars to Elvis for 20 years. Elvis walked in and started buying cars, not even asking the prices. He bought 14 cars, including one for a woman he didn't know. She admired a car he had just bought, and he decided to buy her one. She picked a gold and white Eldorado, and Elvis told Joe Esposito to buy her some clothes to match. Elvis also bought 2 planes. He tried to buy a Boeing 707, but had to withdraw because of a dispute. Instead, he bought a Convair 880 and a Lockheed Jetstar. The Convair was being renovated to look like a luxury airliner, with a living room, dining room, and even a bedroom. He named it after his daughter, Lisa Marie, and painted an American flag and his TCB logo on it. Elvis used the planes to fly his friends to Texas to watch the renovations. He was excited about it and often said, "I'm building me the damnedest thing you've ever seen." The planes were also practical for his tours, as it was often cheaper to own them than to charter. Despite his generous spending, Elvis's father, Vernon, was worried. "Elvis, you got to listen this one time. Son, you're spending money faster than we're macking it," he said. Elvis didn't want to talk about it and walked away. Later, when the colonel refused his gift, Elvis didn't say much. Soon after, 2 of the 4 planes were advertised for sale in the Wall Street Journal. One of the reasons Linda stayed in Elvis's life was her willingness to share him with others. Elvis dated many women, and George Klein, his friend and a Memphis disc jockey, often helped him find new company. One night, George called an 18-year-old named Melissa Blackwood and told her Elvis wanted to see her. She got ready and waited, but Elvis had other plans. The next day, Elvis called Melissa and talked to her for over an hour. He was going on tour the next day, so they didn't meet again until a month later. One night, Elvis called Melissa at 2 a.m. and asked her to come over. She said it was too late, but he offered to pick her up at 7 for breakfast. She went to Graceland, and one of Elvis's friends took her to his bedroom. He was in bed, looking tired and sick. He told her he would be a gentleman and wanted to talk. They talked for a while, and he asked her to change into his pajamas. She was nervous, but did as he asked. They continued talking, and Elvis asked her about her car. She told him she didn't have one, and he ordered a white Pontiac Grand Prix to be delivered to Graceland. Melissa was surprised and touched. They watched the car arrive, and she left to show it to her mother. Later, she returned to Graceland, and Elvis was awake. He seemed upset that she had left and asked her to stay at Graceland. She refused, saying it was too much for her. He tried to convince her, but she was firm. They had a small argument, and she left, feeling sad. That was the last time she ever talked to him. Elvis continued to see other women, like Sandra Zanken, Sybil Shepherd, and Joe Cathy Brownlee. He often gave them cars and jewelry. Despite his many relationships, it was Linda who remained the closest to him. Linda loved making Elvis laugh. Once they were walking through a casino in Vegas with Ricky Stanley, one of Elvis's stepbrothers. A guy approached Linda, thinking she was just another girl in the casino. He didn't know she was Elvis's girlfriend. He tried his usual line, "Would you like to meet Elvis?" Linda played along, acting surprised and excited. Ricky was nearly bursting with laughter, but the guy was too busy trying to impress Linda. When they got to the elevator, Ricky finally told the guy, "This is Elvis's girlfriend." The guy was stunned, and when he asked if she was Sybil Shepherd, Linda joked, "Strike 2, one more." Everyone had a good laugh, and Elvis loved telling the story. Another time, Linda and Elvis decided to play a fun prank at a Vegas party. They blacked out their front teeth and kept their mouths closed, acting serious as they walked down the stairs. The room was dim, and everyone was whispering about how beautiful they looked. When they smiled, people were confused, not sure if they should laugh or pretend they didn't notice. Finally, they broke into laughter, and the party went on. Elvis had a complicated relationship with his ex-wife, Priscilla. She never went on the road with him, while Linda did. Priscilla later pointed out this difference, saying it was unfair. But Elvis had his reasons, telling Priscilla that a wife shouldn't go to work with her husband. In August, Elvis and Linda went to Vegas for his annual Elvis Summer Festival, but things didn't go as planned. Elvis took some pills and had trouble breathing. They had to make an emergency landing in Dallas. After resting, they continued to Vegas, but Elvis's mood was off. He canceled rehearsals and was in a bad mood. During a rehearsal, he told the orchestra he hated Vegas and stormed out. The show that night was okay, but the second night was worse. Elvis didn't even want to go on, but the colonel insisted. After the show, Elvis left Vegas and went back to Memphis. In Memphis, Elvis was admitted to Baptist Hospital, where he was treated for exhaustion. He was overweight and had liver and intestinal problems. Dr. Nick, his doctor, tried to help him with his diet and suggested surgery, but Elvis decided not to go through with it. Instead, he celebrated by eating fast food. While in the hospital, Elvis and Linda watched TV and laughed at game shows. The nurses became close friends, and Elvis even gave one of them a car. When he left the hospital, he went back to his routine, watching movies all night and flying his friends around. He still talked about making a karate film, but it was slow going. Elvis also started playing racquetball, and decided to build courts at Graceland. He bought a new, expensive ring, and gave his designer a car. Elvis was always spending money, even though he was in debt. He needed money, so he agreed to perform in December, something he usually avoided. In December, Elvis returned to Vegas and filled every show, even though it was usually a slow time. He then agreed to perform in a huge stadium in Michigan for New Year's Eve. It was a disaster. The stadium was too big and it was freezing cold. Elvis's pants even ripped during the show. Despite the challenges, the show went on, and Elvis kept performing, even though he was broke and struggling. Elvis's mood was dark as he stormed out of the venue, cursing and blaming everyone in sight for the show's problems. Linda, usually the one to calm him down with sweet talk, just sat in silence, too afraid to say anything. A few days later, the entertainment papers announced that the concert had grossed $800,000, a world record at the time. Elvis kept about half of it, but the money didn't seem to lift his spirits. 1976 began with no clear plans, but it quickly turned chaotic. Elvis's birthday on January 8th rolled around, and he decided to celebrate in Vail, Colorado, with Linda and a few of his closest friends. Despite not liking birthdays, Elvis seemed to want company this time. Jerry Schilling, one of his friends, arranged for 3 condominiums, even convincing a family to give up their vacation. Linda baked a cake, and things seemed to start off well, but the trip quickly turned into a nightmare. Elvis was still bothered by the ongoing lawsuits involving some of his bodyguards. Red and Sonny, who were with him, got a lot of criticism for their rough tactics. Elvis snapped at them, saying, "I'm the one they sue." Red tried to defend himself, but Elvis wouldn't listen. The tension grew, and Elvis's mood swung wildly. He told his friends to get back to the condo when they weren't there, and then he'd fight with them when they were. One of the lowest points was when Elvis decided he wanted to move into the condo that Jerry and Mina Smith had rented. He called Jerry in the middle of the night and demanded to move in immediately. Jerry, exhausted and frustrated, told Elvis to take the condo and quit his job. The next morning, Elvis called to apologize, but the damage was done. Despite the chaos, there were moments of laughter. Elvis and his remaining friends rented snowmobiles for late-night rides through the snowy woods. He even visited a luxury car dealership in Denver at 3 in the morning, buying expensive cars for some of the people who had helped him. When he saw a news report about his car buying spree, he sent a Cadillac to the local TV station just because the anchorman joked about wanting one too. Elvis was losing control. He hadn't recorded new material in almost 9 months, and RCA was getting desperate. They brought recording equipment to Graceland, hoping to get Elvis to sing. The road band and top Nashville studio musicians were flown in, but Elvis didn't show up. He sent word that he was sick and had a doctor with him. The tension grew as everyone waited, and by midnight, the jokes had turned into anxious worry. Elvis's behavior was erratic. He told Red and Dave about a plan to kill the city's top drug dealers, driven by his anger over his stepbrother Ricky's heroin addiction. He showed them his arsenal of weapons, including rifles, pistols, and even rocket launchers. He wanted to use the recording sessions as a cover, while he went on a vigilante mission. Luckily, the plan never came to fruition, and the recording sessions finally began. In 7 days, Elvis recorded a dozen songs, but his performance was weak. The lyrics were sad, and his voice, though still rich, lacked the confidence and energy of his earlier work. The songs, including Solitaire, Danny Boy, and Hurt, reflected his declining health and spirits. The album, From Elvis Presley Boulevard, was released in May, but it didn't capture the magic of his earlier recordings. Elvis's moods continued to swing wildly. One moment, he'd be excited about the recording setup, and the next, he'd threaten to shoot the speakers. He tried to regain control, going on health kicks, fasting, and even following a fad diet that left him weak and bedridden. In February, he started seeing a hypnotist, William Foote, to help with his emotional problems and pain. Foot taught him relaxation techniques, but Elvis's dependency on medication was evident in his slurred speech. Elvis went back on the road, but the tours were short and frequent, a sign of his declining health. He lost some of his best musicians, including Glenn D. Hardin, David Briggs, and Ronnie Tutt, who left for better opportunities. The new band struggled to keep up, and rehearsals were often cold and unproductive. The chaos of 1976 was a stark contrast to Elvis's earlier days. His once sharp edge was blunted, and the magic that had made him a legend was fading. Despite his efforts, Elvis was losing his grip on the life he had built. Elvis Presley's 1976 tours were a whirlwind of excitement and challenges. It was the year of America's bicentennial, a time of national pride and celebration. Elvis, always the showman, seemed to embrace the spirit of the year, but beneath the surface, things were far more complex. The first stop of the tour was Johnson City, Tennessee. Elvis performed 3 shows there, and while he was a bit grumpy with his new band members, he still managed to charm the crowd. He invited J.D. Sumner, a member of the Stamps, to hold out his Elvis hand, the one adorned with expensive rings Elvis had given him. Elvis joked about a bumper sticker on his Cadillac that read, "I paid for this, Elvis didn't buy it." After the show, the owner of the motel where Elvis stayed cut up the sheets he slept on and the aluminum foil from his windows, selling them in 1-inch squares to eager fans. Every city on the tour was a mix of adoration and chaos. In Charlotte, a girl rushed the stage and kissed Elvis so hard that she cut his lip. In another city, a small boy in a tiny Elvis suit was lifted onto the stage, and Elvis tried to get him to shake his legs and sing Hound Dog. In Cincinnati, yellow-jacketed ushers were knocked over by women rushing to the stage. Elvis insisted on turning on the house lights so he could see his audience. He joked about his road family, accepted gifts from fans, and gave out kisses and scarves. He often sang patriotic songs like America, or God Bless America. His entrance was always dramatic, with the iconic Thus Spake Zarathustra from 2001, A Space Odyssey, and his shows always ended with I Can't Help Falling in Love with You, followed by a final pose, arms outstretched, smiling as the band behind him played and the crowd roared. The connection between Elvis and his fans was unique. One writer described his Long Beach show as feeling more like a visit among friends than a concert. Elvis was so good at connecting with his audience that it seemed effortless, but sometimes he would just hang on the microphone, as if he was just going through the motions. His former sidekick recalled that Elvis sometimes seemed disengaged, standing there with his thumb hooked in his belt, as if he was just there to sing a few songs and pass out a few scarves. John Wilkinson, a member of Elvis's band, noticed that Elvis seemed to have lost his enthusiasm. No matter how hard we tried to pump him up, Elvis would just stand there, Wilkinson said. Elvis struggled with memory loss, forgetting the lyrics to some of his recent hits. Occasionally, he would lose his balance and slur his words. Tony Brown, the pianist, remembered nights when Elvis would stand on stage for minutes at a time, doing nothing, while the audience screamed for him to perform. Despite these struggles, Elvis's shows were still a hit. He finished his second tour in Spokane on April 27th, and opened in Lake Tahoe 4 days later. During this engagement, he was visited by John O'Grady, a private detective who had helped Elvis with a paternity suit. O'Grady was a tough former narcotics cop who knew a thing or two about drugs. He had helped Elvis with background checks on women, and shared his knowledge about prescription drugs. Elvis carried the Merck Manual with him, a book that described all prescription drugs, their side effects, and recommended dosages. He memorized everything about the drugs he took, including Hycodin, Demerol, Percotin, Valium, Placidil, and Phenobarb. O'Grady was concerned about Elvis's health. He noticed that Elvis was bloated, his eyes were almost closed, and he was fighting to make a good appearance. O'Grady called Elvis's lawyer, Ed Hookstratton, and warned that Elvis had only a year to live unless he got medical help. They made plans to get Elvis into a hospital in San Diego, followed by a year of rehabilitation in Hawaii. However, when O'Grady presented the plan to Priscilla, Elvis rejected it, saying he could handle it on his own. 17 days after closing in Lake Tahoe, Elvis was back on the road. He toured through Indiana, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, and Arizona, finishing in Atlanta, a city with a deep love for Elvis. Despite performing 12 shows in 11 days, Elvis managed to keep going. One of the best shows of the tour was in Fort Worth, where Elvis sang on pitch, performed entire songs, and gave a memorable performance. But the next night, he was stoned again, giving a slower, shorter show that was disappointing compared to his previous performances. The tours continued through June and July, with Elvis performing 12 shows in 11 days. The constant travel and performances began to take a toll on his relationships with his band and crew. Joe Guercio, the orchestra leader, noticed that the once explosive performances were becoming less frequent. Even Guercio, who had been a loyal supporter, sometimes stayed home in Las Vegas, sending the trombonist Marty Harrell to conduct in his place. Elvis's humor, while sometimes demeaning and goofy, was still a part of his shows. He made jokes about band members and interacted with the audience in his unique way. One night, he was given a loaded water pistol and began spritzing J.D. Sumner and the Stamps. On Marty Harrell's first night as conductor, the orchestra remained silent when Marty gave the downbeat, making Elvis laugh. In July, Elvis's father, Vernon, called Sonny West, Dave Hebler, and Red West to inform them that they were being let go. The decision was not whimsical. It came after much deliberation and advice from trusted associates. The bodyguards were becoming a financial and legal liability, and Elvis had to cut back on expenses. The news was a blow to Red, Sonny, and Dave, who had been with Elvis for years. They were hurt that Elvis didn't tell them himself. Elvis went back on the road on August 27th, touring through the South. Despite the challenges, his shows continued to sell out, and his records were still a huge success. On August 21st, RCA announced that Elvis had sold over 400 million records, far more than any other artist. However, the late summer and autumn tours were a disaster. Elvis's health continued to decline, and his performances were inconsistent. His pianist, Tony Brown, remembered a particularly grim matinee in Houston, where Elvis was so loaded that he mumbled through his songs. Joe Mescal, the leader of the Imperials, saw Elvis in Huntsville, Alabama, and was shocked by his condition. Elvis was fat and sick, and he confided to Joe that he didn't even want to be there. The tours continued through the fall, with Elvis performing in the Midwest and the West. He had 2 weeks off for Christmas, and then went on his 9th tour of the year. The constant touring and the stress of his personal life were taking a toll on Elvis, and the future looked uncertain. The tension between Elvis and his former bodyguards, Red, Sonny, and Dave, was reaching a breaking point. They were determined to tell their side of the story, and they found a willing collaborator in Steve Dunleavy, an Australian gossip columnist. Dunleavy agreed to help them write a book, which they hoped would expose the truth about their time with Elvis and warn him about what they saw as his destructive habits. Despite Elvis's attempts to silence them with a generous offer of $50,000 each, they refused. They were committed to their mission, even if it meant risking their friendship with the king. Elvis was furious when he learned about the book. He tried to reach out to Red, even calling him at his motel in Hollywood. The conversation was tense, and Red stood firm, knowing that they had to tell their story. Meanwhile, Elvis's concerns about the book were less about himself and more about the potential harm it could bring to his family and friends. He confided in Jerry Schilling, expressing his worry about how the book might affect Lisa Marie and his other close relationships. But the drama surrounding the book was just one of the many struggles Elvis was facing. His relationship with Linda, his longtime companion, was also coming to an end. Linda had always been a constant presence in Elvis's life, but over time, she began to feel suffocated by the all-consuming nature of their relationship. She wanted more for herself, more room to grow and be her own person. The strain between them grew, and their fights became more frequent and intense. Linda finally decided she had to leave, and she did so dramatically, charging $30,000 on Elvis's master charge card before she went. Elvis's reaction to Linda's departure was surprisingly calm, even a bit amused. He seemed to understand that sometimes, even the strongest relationships can reach their end. However, the void left by Linda's absence was quickly filled. George Klein, Elvis's trusted friend, began looking for a new companion for the king. One of the names on his list was Ginger Alden, a young and beautiful Miss Mid-South, who had grown up admiring Elvis from afar. When Ginger was invited to Graceland, she was nervous but excited. She spent her first night with Elvis, and soon she became a regular part of his life. Elvis's shows during this period were a mixed bag. His performances were often brilliant, but they were also affected by his use of drugs and the emotional turmoil in his personal life. One night, while Vernon was in the hospital, Elvis had a near-death experience, hanging from the drapes in his room and crying out for help. He was deeply affected by this incident, and it led him to question his life and his purpose. A visit from televangelist Rex Humbard only added to his spiritual turmoil, as Elvis grappled with the idea of giving up his music to serve God. Despite the challenges, Elvis continued to perform, and one of his best shows was a New Year's Eve concert in Pittsburgh. The band and Elvis were in high spirits, and even a snowy message in the park didn't dampen their mood. Elvis's dedication to his craft was unwavering, and he always aimed to give his best to his fans. When Ginger's grandfather passed away, Elvis went to great lengths to support her, organizing a trip to Arkansas for the funeral. He even wanted to buy the most expensive coffin, but Ginger's mother insisted on a more modest option. Elvis's kindness and attention to detail were evident in how he took care of Ginger and her family. A few weeks later, Elvis decided it was time to propose to Ginger. He called Lowell Hayes, a jeweler, in the middle of the night, demanding a diamond as big as the one in his Tesabe ring. Lowell was initially skeptical, but Elvis was determined. After hours of phone calls and negotiations, Lowell managed to create a beautiful ring, and Elvis proposed to Ginger in the bathroom of Graceland. She said yes, and the ring, worth $70,000, sealed their engagement. Despite the joy of their new relationship, Ginger was hesitant about going to Nashville with Elvis for his recording sessions. She didn't want to go, and she told Elvis so. He insisted, and though she was firm, she eventually gave in. Their relationship was just beginning, and both were learning to navigate the complexities of their lives together. Elvis's life was a roller coaster of highs and lows, and by 1977, the lows were becoming more frequent. His relationship with Ginger Alden was tumultuous, filled with moments of intense love and dramatic confrontations. One night, Ginger stormed out of Graceland, and Elvis, in a desperate attempt to get her to return, chased after her with a pistol, firing shots into the air. Ginger saw it as a sign of his love, but the media painted it as a desperate act. Despite the tension, Ginger eventually came back, but she still refused to go to Nashville with him. Elvis's musical ambitions faced setbacks too. RCA, his record company, was frustrated by his lack of new material. They scheduled recording sessions, but Elvis was inconsistent. During one session in Graceland, he couldn't get the sound right and called it off, leaving the musicians and backup singers waiting in vain. It was a sign of his declining focus and health. In February, Elvis embarked on a short tour, performing in cities he hadn't visited before. Ginger and her family joined him, but the tour was unremarkable. Elvis was overweight and seemed disinterested, often reading lyrics from a sheet and performing lackluster shows. His famous moves were a shadow of their former glory, and he looked bored on stage. Despite the challenges, Elvis found a moment of peace when he signed his will on March 3rd. He named his daughter Lisa Marie, his father Vernon, and his grandmother Minnie Mee as his principal beneficiaries. Vernon was given control over the estate, a decision that would have significant implications later. Elvis then took a much-needed break in Hawaii, bringing along a large group of friends and family. For a brief time, his health improved, and he seemed happier. But the vacation was cut short when sand got into his eyes, and he returned to his busy schedule. The tour that followed brought Elvis back to the places where he had first gained fame. These were the small towns and cities where he had played honky-tonks and appeared on the backs of flatbed trucks. To the people there, Elvis was still the embodiment of the American dream, and his appearance, despite his weight, didn't matter. They saw him as one of their own, someone who had risen from poverty to stardom. However, the shows were a mixed bag. Some were good, but many were lackluster. On March 31st in Alexandria, Louisiana, Elvis was supposed to perform, but he never made it to the stage. The news of his absence caused chaos, and the show was ultimately canceled. Elvis was flown back to Memphis, where he checked into the hospital. Dr. Nick, Elvis's primary doctor, was in a difficult position. He had become Elvis's main source of prescription drugs, and he knew this contributed to Elvis's struggles. He hoped to help Elvis wean off the drugs, but the situation was complex. The media began to take notice of Elvis's struggles. Tabloids like the National Star and the National Enquirer published unflattering stories and photos, portraying Elvis as an overweight, over-the-hill performer. The press, which had once been forgiving, turned harsh, with critics writing scathing reviews of his performances. Despite the negative attention, Elvis continued to tour. He faced criticism from reviewers who described his shows as disappointing and his performances as lackluster. The members of his band and backup singers were deeply affected by the harsh reviews, but Elvis kept moving forward, driven by a sense of duty and the love of his fans. Elvis's life in 1977 was a testament to his resilience and the enduring impact he had on the music world. Even in his struggles, he remained a symbol of the American dream, a reminder that even the brightest stars can face dark times.